there is no differentiating factors between people that believe in Jesus and people that don't. And that's super
Mm.
sad for me. And so collectively, like we've just settled for, like I said, this broken down shadow at best representation that's super confusing. Why would anyone want to follow Christ? And what's the good news when our lives look no different than anybody else?
Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. I'm so glad you joined us today. Hey, and if it's your first time, make sure you subscribe. You'll never miss an episode. We interview some of the most fascinating people, I think, on the planet in the church leadership space. Whether you're a business leader invested in the church or a pastor, you're going to love it. So today, we're going to talk about entrepreneurial pastors. When is it time to leave your job? I interview Zach Zehnder. I think you're going to love it. And hey, just two quick notes before we get to today's episode. If you want to be the first to get 2025's church trends, be sure to join my email list. On January 2nd, I'll be releasing all 5 trends along with a leader guide. And throughout January, I'll be dropping more church trends content, podcast episodes, and resources. So to get it, just go to ontherisenewsletter.com or click the link in the description wherever you're listening or watching. And hey, we need to talk about State of the Church because you are getting invited to access all the latest State of the Church research from Barna. You'll get free updates on monthly research drops, trending topics, and important news from across the church, all powered by Gloo. Text my name, Carey25, to 46816, and you'll get yours today. And now, here is my conversation with Zach Zehnder. Well, Zach, welcome to the podcast. It's good to have you.
It's great to be on with you, Carey.
Yeah, so I would love to know, what is a commonly held belief about church leadership or discipleship that you just don't buy into, you think is wrong? And I'd love to know why. We'll start in the shallow end of the pool. So let's
you're
start
just
there.
jumping right in. I love it.
Yeah, why not? Why not? Let's not waste time.
Yeah, I think it's great. I think obviously you have a leadership podcast and I super believe in leadership and leadership development. I've been a longtime listener. I think I started in the double digits, so I missed the first few, but you poured into so
cool.
many of us to develop us as leaders. And so I love leadership development. I think probably the thing that we get wrong is there's a lot of similarities with discipleship and leadership. Right. I actually think the goal of leadership development and discipleship training is the same. It's to produce great leaders, and especially in the church, to produce great, followers of Jesus. But I think there's probably maybe a little more emphasis on leadership development, leadership pathway in church than there is in discipleship pathway.
Okay.
And that's where I really think we need all the leadership we can get. We need so much of it. But if you can't follow Jesus well, I'm not sure how you're going to lead others well. And so I really believe that the thing that's missing, or the thing that we get wrong with discipleship formation and leadership, is this is, I think, the start of it. And if we just don't have it or neglect it or only focus on the leadership side and not the discipleship side, again, they're so similar, but we've got to introduce that as kind of the infrastructure and the base of all of this. We got to be able to say at some point, like the Apostle Paul, right? Imitate me as I imitate Christ. And if we can't get to the place where we're following Jesus well, it's not going to work well. We're not going to produce the leaders that make disciples, which is what we want to do in churches.
So do you see that, not using the word of the year, manifesting, but do you see that showing up in leaders or the people that come to faith as we move them into leadership, or all of the above? I'd love to know where you see that playing out.
Yeah, I think all of the above, Carey. I think when I look at discipleship as a whole, and when I look at metrics, in America that I'm sure are true for Canada and other places as well, what I've seen is we've gotten really good in the church space at creating believers, but there is a difference between a believer and a follower of Jesus. And I think all of our church metrics can be going in the right way. I'm not saying they are, but they can all be going in the right way. And yet we can still produce people that aren't the disciples that Jesus is after and what really his heart wants for us. And that's where I think the real problem comes, is when we've got all these really great systems, and I'm all about systems, but when we've got all these great systems that are pouring into us, but it's not producing the output that it ought to. And I really believe that's the great problem we're seeing in Christianity today, is we've got all these systems, but it's not actually producing the people that Jesus called us to produce. And so somewhere there's something broken. And I think when we only look at the bigger things and we don't talk about the thing underneath all of it, which is discipleship, I really believe, we're going to continue to create what I call half-hearted, broken down, shadow at best, and mediocre representatives of Christ. And like he's been too good in your story and my story for us to settle for that. So yeah.
So how do you see that? Like, one of my challenges, I literally ask leaders, how do you define discipleship? I get 20 answers and they're all different. And they don't even necessarily agree with each other. And some people are honest enough, and these are pastors, they're honest enough to say, I really don't know.
Yeah.
How do you define discipleship?
Yeah. So here's what I would say. Like, it is hard to be a disciple, but to understand discipleship shouldn't be a problem. And so that's where I do struggle with. I agree. Like, you asked 20 pastors, and we're the experts, by the way.
Yeah,
And
we're
you get
supposed
20,
to be.
yeah, we're supposed to be.
Yeah.
And you get 20 different definitions. And so for me, a disciple, the way I define discipleship is you are being and doing like your leader. And for us, our leader is Jesus. And so the more we be in the way that Jesus invites us, and the more we do as he asks us, the more we're going to be those great disciples that he calls us to be. Now, of course, that is simple to understand, but how to do that and actually live it out, I think, is where the challenge is. But I do think we ought to come back to the fact, though, that like, we don't have to. I'm all about new things, and I love to think I'm an entrepreneurial, creative guy. But my answer for discipleship is actually we don't need to reinvent anything, because God loves us so much. He sent his son into the world to, yes, be our savior, yes, be our redeemer, but also to show us a way and to model for us what it looks like to be in perfect relationship with God. And so our goal then ought to be to look at Jesus as much as we possibly can, and to learn from him, and to put what he asked us to put into practice. Let's just practice that and do that. So like, that's the answer to discipleship. Now, how we do that in our world is really challenging, but to understand it shouldn't be as hard as we've made it.
So when discipleship is broken, let's get really practical. What does that look like? Like, what happens to leaders? What happens to people when they are malformed? To quote John Mark Comer, what happens with that? Or Pete Scazzaro? I mean, it's a similar vibe. What do you see? What are, like, if I'm looking at my life, how do I know my discipleship is off?
Yeah, I think it's good. And I think what happens is kind of a collective and a personal. I would say there's answers to both of those. So collectively, what I think happens when we don't get this right, or when we're malformed, as you said, I think it just leads to a lot of confusion. And when we don't know what we're doing and where to go and what to aim at, like, it just leads to the representation of Jesus that right now in our nation, like, there is no differentiating factors between people that believe in Jesus and people that don't. And that's super sad for me. And so collectively, like, we've just settled for, like I said, this broken down, shadow at best representation that's super confusing. Why would anyone want to follow Christ? And what's the good news when our lives look no different than anybody else? So that's the collective side. I think on the personal side, I think both as a follower, just an everyday follower, but also as a pastor, I think this is the opposite of what Jesus came to give us, but I think it actually leads, our guilt in this leads to shame. Because we know that this is important. Like, you ask any pastor and they're like, it's one of the most important things. In fact, in 2022, Lifeway researched a study and they asked pastors, like, what's your greatest need that you need to improve in and you're willing to invest in? And at the top of that, 63% was disciple making over all the other things like communication and technology, all these things that are important. Disciple making is at the top, which means pastors know it's important. And it also means they don't know what to do. And so I think that leads to, like, shame. Like, I know I should be doing this and I'm not. And I feel bad because I ought to be doing this personally myself, and I ought to be leading others in my church to be doing this. Oh man. And that leads to shame. And like, that's the opposite of what Jesus came to give us. And so, yeah, personal and collective, like, when we don't get this right, it has serious ramifications of our Christian witness, and even how the enemy talks to us and the shame that he gives to us.
So, my take, feel free to completely disagree, is COVID hit 5 years ago now, almost. And we kind of realized, wow, we've got a very polarized, tribalized, angry group of people who call themselves Christians. And the dialogue for the last 5 years has been discipleship, because a lot of Christians walked away, a lot of people left. Evangelism is almost on its deathbed right now. We can talk about that some other time. But discipleship has been the buzzword. And yet what you see is Christians, as you hinted at, I think in large measure becoming more angry, more the opposite of the fruits of the Spirit, more politicized, tribalized, weaponized, angry than ever before. I'd love your take on why discipleship seems to be having a moment as a topic, and then why Christians, particularly evangelicals, probably are becoming less like Jesus, not more like Jesus. There's my editorial comment. Again, feel free to take this where you want. Feel free to completely disagree with me.
I totally agree with you, by the way. So don't worry about the disagreeing part. I think in COVID, what we realized is, I think what we realized collectively, at least in the American churches, is like we've gotten really good at creating believers, but we have created very few followers. And that's a big part of my message is like, you can believe in Jesus, which is great for your eternity, and you should live in that confidence and that eternal security. But the abundant life that Jesus talks about in John 10:10, I really believe is found right now. His kingdom is here right now. You can be a disciple right now. You can get glimpses of it right now. And until we live that out and experience that, like you can somehow believe in Jesus and settle for some mediocre life. And that's not what God wanted to give you. And so I really think what happened in COVID is we recognized that there is a difference between believing in Jesus and actually following him. And while we've gotten really good in all of our tribes to, get people to the waters of baptism or to conversion, or in some circles to make a decision of faith, we've gotten really good at doing that, and we ought to celebrate those moments. That's awesome. It's really great to believe in Jesus. But that confidence in your eternal security is meant to produce a different person right now as you live in this world. And so that's where I think the gap is we recognized that there's something deeper underneath all of this than even believing in Jesus, that we've got to bring more into the everyday. We've got to help people see that Jesus makes a difference and how to live practically as a disciple so that they can not only have the blessing of eternal life, but really, I think, experience and not settle for a mediocre life. They can get the abundant life now. And so that really, I think, was kind of elevated in COVID times. And so that we kind of recognized it then. And now I think it's the buzzword, but I think everybody's still trying to figure this out. And so I've really been blessed, since I'd say 2011 is when I really started thinking about discipleship more, but probably especially more in the last 7-8 years to like live in this discipleship space more than most. And so I've really been blessed to like have this moment probably prior to COVID where I'm already asking simple questions that can kind of help people understand more, I hope, about what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. And I think the real problem is we recognize that that's underneath it all. But until we get a little bit above that and kind of get more practical, okay, I get it that that's really important. Now, how do I do it is the question most people jump to. And I think it's the wrong first question. And to me, the right first question with disciple making, with discipleship is this: are you really committed to following Jesus? That's it. Like, are you committed to following Jesus? Because his answers are in the Gospels for us. And now we need to get a little more granular, a little more practical about what that means to daily live it out. But the question every one of us has to wrestle with, if we believe in Jesus, is are we committed to truly following him? And if we are, cool. Now let's have a conversation and let's talk about practical things of what it looks like to follow Jesus.
So if I had a 15-second definition of discipleship, you're like, hey, what does it actually mean? Where's this all going? I would say it looks an awful lot like the fruits of the Holy Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. And when it comes to truth, it is always inseparably fused with grace. Grace is fused with truth. Truth is one with grace. That's about it. That's what my life should be looking more and more like every year. Some days I get it. Some days I don't. Some episodes I'm there, some episodes I'm not. Welcome to this side of eternity. That's my 15-second summary. I'd love to hear yours.
I love it. And I think that's really good, Carey. I think there's a piece in the middle that I feel like is really important to talk about that a lot of people miss and a lot of churches miss. And so, I'm all about the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness. And those ought to be the outcomes of what we experience. But to me, there's a piece in the middle that I just call it targets. Like, that's great, love, joy, peace, patience, but also I just kind of need to know what to do to follow Christ. And so it's hard to say, do love, do joy, do peace. So what are the tangible things that I can do? So this true story at the church I was at in Florida, where it really helped me think about this more, is we had somebody that was new to the faith, and I was blessed to actually be able to introduce him to the faith. And he started coming to church, and he was baptized, and it was a big moment. Like, his family came, friends came, and it was really awesome to see. Like, our church celebrated like crazy. We were a small church plant at that time, so any baptisms are always awesome to celebrate.
Yeah, they are.
And so a week later, he came up to me and he said, "Zach, it was an awesome moment. I don't feel any different, and I don't know what to do. What do I do?" And this was my answer to him, which I felt horrible about after, which is a really good seminary answer, Carey, but not a great answer for what he was asking. I said, "Nothing. You don't need to do anything. You're already saved by grace. It's good, bro. You're good." And again, a really good seminary answer about our eternity. But what he was asking from me was for handles of, like, practically, how do I get better at following Jesus? And I didn't have the answer. And that sent me on a long journey of, like, what do we do? And my answer for this was, it makes total sense. This is not my idea. It's Jesus' idea, that we ought to hear the words of Jesus and put them into practice. This is end of Sermon on the Mount, this beautiful, countercultural, amazing, awe-inspiring sermon that Jesus gives. And at the end of it, like, it's so simple, like it feels like the three little pigs ripped him off. If you want your house to stand when the storms come, hear what I say, put it into practice. And so that, I know I'm going more than 15 seconds, but I want to kind of get you, like, the piece that I think is missing in so many people, is that put me on a long journey then to look then at everything that Jesus said. We call it those red letters in a lot of your Bibles. What did Jesus say? And I was particularly looking at, what are the commands, the calls, the things that Jesus asks us to do. And because that's really got to be where we find what it looks like to be a disciple, is Jesus came and he asked us, he told us what to do. So what did he do? And so I jotted down everything I could. And at the end of it, I was trying to find, it's not an exhaustive list, but my simple brain can remember 5 things. So what are the 5 targets that I feel like came out of the mouth of Jesus the most when it came to his imperatives, his commands, his calls? And these are the targets for me. It starts with being, which is all about growing in our relationship with God, forgiving, serving, giving, and then going. And that going is sharing the gospel. It's a making disciples. It's a leadership development side of things. But being, forgiving, sharing, giving, going. I think those are the targets that I think a lot of times, and I always tell pastors, you can choose other ones if you want. And I can help you choose those. And we can talk about what it looks like to choose targets that fit for your context. But, like, those are the things then that, if we're doing those things enough, should produce the fruits of the Spirit that God gives to us. And so when we don't know where to aim, we're going to be super confused the entire time. But when we can kind of get something we're aiming at, to at least be a start, I really challenge pastors to start with, like, let's identify what targets you could hit at your church.
So why aren't we getting it? Why does the discipleship crisis not seem to be going away? Why do we seem to be the opposite of perhaps what we are supposed to be?
I think it comes back to that. Are you committed to following Jesus? I think it's really hard. I think in the end of it, like, God's been so good in all of our stories, but we get caught up in a world that just offers some really, really beautiful things to us, offers us a lot of glitz and glamour, and our eyes can get enamored, our hearts can get enamored with the things of this world. And we settle, I know I do, I settle for comfort far too often. It's an idol of mine. And to be a disciple of Jesus, again, I always say it's simple to understand, but it's uncomfortable. It's not easy for me to go out and tell somebody about Jesus or share the good news or share my faith with strangers or with people that I'm in everyday relationship with. It's not easy for me when you talk about giving, to sacrifice. And when I really look at how Jesus gave, like, to give the way that he gave? Are you kidding me? Like, that is a challenge, and it's just uncomfortable. So I really think that, like, that's the truth of it, is like, it's our broken, sinful nature that we get caught up in this world, and we don't like the answer that Jesus provides, and we don't like the things that Jesus calls us to do. And so it's really hard. I would say on the flip side of it, though, Carey, I think it offers for people, like I said, the abundant life. So many people today are searching for meaning, purpose, fulfillment, significance, joy, happiness. Use whatever words you want. They all kind of fall in that same category. And I would say that though being a disciple of Jesus is hard, it provides significance and meaning and purpose. And those things, I think, the more you put them into practice and kind of exercise that discipleship muscle, those things end up winning the day in a world that is very, very tempting and very challenging to push us in the other direction. So I think we just have to wrestle with, like, are we committed to doing this? And is Jesus that good enough in our stories that we're committed to do the uncomfortable things, do the hard stuff, and in the end, make a difference, which is really fun.
So going back to being, which is really on my mind a lot these days when I think about the fruit of what we are producing, which is really kind of a take on discipleship. Studies for the last 20, 30 years have consistently shown unchurched people's number one gripe with Christians is our hypocrisy, our anger, our judgmentalism, our narrow-mindedness, our bigotry, our all of the above. In other words, they look at Jesus and go, he wasn't that, but you guys. It's a take on Gandhi, who says, I like your Christ, don't like your Christians, right? So when it comes to a state of being, do you have any theories on why it's not getting better and arguably becoming maybe a tad worse?
Yeah, I would echo, like, we teach those 5 targets: be, forgive, serve, give, and go. And after a couple of years of writing about this and some folks using our material, I really did recognize that all 5 targets are important. I believe being is the most important of the 5.
Well, the rest flows out of being,
And that's
right?
exactly why.
Like if
Yep.
if you're just going and serving and sharing and you're doing it, then you pretty much have work salvation at that point. But out of being in itself is not knowledge, it's love, and love compels us. Love moves us out. So that's what I'm really thinking through. And I'm honestly, like, I'm not sitting here on the answer. I am baffled as to why we are not making more progress. And as you know, being a longtime listener, and we've known each other for years, that's why I keep doing this. I just keep asking the question over and over again and getting different takes, trying to figure out what the heck is going on.
Yeah, and I think that's so good. That, like, right, grace is what compels us. So obviously,
Yeah.
for me, the answer, if all the doing things are not showing up well, and they're not, because the targets we're known for, as you said, are judgmental, hypocrisy, bigotry, division, all those things. And this is part of, like, the case for this, Carey. I first read about that in the book Unchristian 2010. I think
Yeah.
was when that book came out. And for me, as you think about it, like, one of the first words I think about for Jesus is grace. And yet we're known for judgment. Like, we're not just missing the mark by a little bit. By definition, those are polar opposites. Grace is getting a free gift that you don't deserve. Judgment is getting exactly what you do deserve. And so it's not like Jesus is here and we're super close to him. Like, we're the opposite. Something's got to change. And I really do believe it does happen with being. The answer in our doing problems is not gritting our teeth together and I'm just going to be more loving and I'm going to go be forgiving and I'm going to serve because pastor tells me to serve. No, if we're having a doing problem, my hunch is we're probably having a being issue. And before God ever asks us to do anything, he invites us to be in a relationship with him. And so this is when my brain then went further with being of, if we think about it, again, amazing that God sent Jesus into this world. Wouldn't it be cool if there was one person in this world, Carey, that was in perfect relationship with God that we could learn from and we could, like, practice the habits that he practiced? And so then my brain went further in this journey of, like, well, what does it look like to be the way that Jesus be? That doesn't make sense grammatically, but what did Jesus do in order to be with God, if that makes sense? And so my next project was then looking at all some would call them spiritual disciplines. I really like with the new science and stuff, the Charles Duhigg Keystone Habits. What are the keystone habits that Jesus had in his life that helped him connect with God while he was here in this world? If he had habits in his life, and I want to be more like him, I should probably have those same habits in my life. And so I went on another journey to look into the Gospels and read what were the habits. And I was, again, not trying to find 20 or 30, because you can get lists that high of spiritual disciplines. But what are the 5 habits that Jesus had in his life that connected with God? And you find that he committed to community, he studied scripture, he prioritized prayer, he sought solitude, and he chose church. Church was different for him, but every day he went to the temple courts, and he not only listened but he also participated. And so, these are, if Jesus had these in his life, we should have them in our life. That's my main point in all this, Carey, is like, we don't have to look far. We just got to study Jesus and do what he said and be in the way that he was with God. And this stuff, hopefully, the needle will move and will be more known, less for words like judgment, hypocrisy, bigoted, divisive, and more for the words of Christ, which is really what we're after.
So I want to pivot a little bit and talk about your story, because you're doing all this and writing on this and speaking on this while you're pastoring in a local church. And I want to go back. You planted a church from scratch. You transitioned a couple of years ago to become a teaching pastor at a very large, growing Lutheran church in the Midwest. Would it be the Midwest? Yeah, I think so.
Omaha, Nebraska. Go Big Red, baby. Yeah.
There you go, Nebraska. There you are. So I'd love to go back to what prompted you to launch a church, to start a church, and you did it in the context of a mainline denomination. I mean, we've got, I think evangelical non-denominational is now the biggest denomination in the U.S., but we have a lot of denominational leaders listening as well. So take us back to that moment. What caused you to launch a church?
Yeah, I think specifically the church planting side, the more you know my story, I've always been kind of entrepreneurial. Even in college and seminary, and even the first 6 years of our church plant in Florida, I had a business where I was selling golf head covers, the brand name head covers, where I'd buy them in bulk and sell them online individually. And that was my primary source of income. Even as we started the church plant, it was a bivocational thing.
Sorry, let's back that up. You bought bulk head covers for golf clubs, and you sold them individually, and the spread was your income?
Yeah, exactly. So we would go through seminary, and that was, we took an extra year in seminary because the business was going well, and that paid for seminary and really allowed us to. We started with a bivocational call where that was my primary source of income, and so I've always been wired that way. So church planting is like the entrepreneurial side of church, and so I thought that could be a fit for me, and so that's kind of the church plant side. I would say. The other piece about it too, Carey, I'm a 4th generation Lutheran Church Missouri Synod pastor. And so I stand on broad shoulders of my dad, my grandpa, my great grandpa, and of course, amazing wives in that group. And that's part of my legacy. I was never forced into it. Dad never, it was my decision. It was the Holy Spirit moving in me to lead me to this. But I really felt like this was a legacy thing for me. I love talking about legacy. I love thinking about my great grandpa. I never met him. But he made a decision 100 years before I became a pastor that I'm still feeling the ripple effects of today. And so I love teaching people you can make a decision today that 100 years from now would still cause ripple effects. Really cool. And so for me, the church planting side as well, growing up with a great family and a great history, I really felt because I went through university and as I went through seminary, I'm not saying it wasn't without challenges, but I don't know that my faith was tested very much, if I'm real with you. And so I really wanted to go into church planting into Mount Dora, Florida, where I knew one person that lived 45 minutes away. And I was walking into a city, a much smaller city than the Apostle Paul would walk into in the book of Acts. But I was walking into a city and God, I don't know what I'm doing. And it feels really good to every day have my faith on the line and to kind of be tested from what I would say was for the first time in my life, over and over and over again, I was ready to be challenged. And so those are all reasons why the church plant side was fun for me. Yeah.
When you're part of an established tradition, like a mainline denomination, and I mean, that's my background too, what was the support / receptivity to church planting? I mean, if you're in a non-denominational context, it's almost like, yeah, this is in the water supply. But I'm wondering what your experience was in the context of a mainline denomination.
Yeah, mainline denominations are interesting. They have their blessings, and maybe we'll call them curses too. I don't know that anybody was against church planting. That would be too harsh. But I think overall, as a denomination for us, it's kind of challenging when we're about church planting and we're about mission work, but when our system has gotten to be so rigid enough that there's not great avenues for church planters. And so I think I came out of it and I went the traditional route because I felt that was good for me. And I went to seminary and we spent 5+ years in St. Louis to go to seminary. But I struggle a little bit right now with where our denomination is with. I feel like why I am a Lutheran is because I love the doctrine. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
I love the purity of doctrine. Is it perfect? No, none of us will have perfect doctrine. I think being a part of a mainline provides checks and balances, which are all really good. But I think a fault right now that I'm experiencing is when purity of doctrine becomes the primary pursuit, even
Mm-hmm.
over mission. Like we're struggling. And we're not training up leaders in the way that we ought to because we've purified our doctrine so much that we've made one system to train pastors. And that's what we're going through in our denomination. It's like you come to seminary and you spend a lot of money. Carey, we're one of the only denominations that don't have an online master's of divinity. And so it's just really tough and challenging to say we're a church that's about mission when we're not providing the platform and the training and the education that can justify churches being planted. And our denomination, like many mainline denominations, is suffering for it. And until we figure this out, it's cool to say you're for church planting, but I really believe that the decisions you make are more telling of what you actually say. And so it's tough. It's challenging. I think we're riding that wave right now where hopefully things can shift and we can find new avenues because church planting is, and it always has been since the book of Acts, the greatest form of evangelism and for reaching new people for a collective group of people. And so we've got to stay in that game and figure out how we can do more and more of that.
Why do you stay in a denomination? I mean, you left your church plant. We can go back to that story in a moment. And then you went to a denominational church. Now you had family ties with this one. But why stay? Why not just, embark out on your own? Someone I know took that path.
Like yourself, right?
Perhaps. That was
Yeah,
me.
I don't know,
Yeah.
Carey. It's challenging, man. I'm wrestling with that truly, and I think why I stay again. I do love the doctrine. I do love
Hmm.
Lutherans we are the ones that herald the justification by grace through faith, and other denominations also cling to that as well. But I really believe that our answers that we provide for some of that are powerful. I love some of the teachings. If we really get deep into it, I believe in infant baptism. I believe
Mm-hmm.
that the sacrament of communion is more than symbolic, and so there's mostly a lot of theological reasons why. Another reason why is I've got so many friends that are in ministry that are like-minded, that do think like me, and there's a big group of us. And so there's people I love and there's theology that I love. And so that would be challenging. But those are the reasons I stay. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Just because I don't think it's ever come up on this podcast, 700 almost episodes into this, infant baptism. So let's be foolish enough to tackle a centuries-old debate
Oh
in 3
man.
minutes. Okay. No, I would just love to know sincerely, because that's something we went to believer baptism when I became non-denominational. I'd love to know why, you hold to that doctrine in a post-Christian culture. And this is not a hostile question. I'm just curious.
Yeah, you're good. I always tell people that come from a little different perspective, your answer's good, but mine's better. And so, hopefully you'll come to my way of thinking. But no, infant baptism.
Yeah.
Why do we do it? There's so many scriptures and there's so many different things. We do believe that God's call to make disciples of all nations is an inclusive call to everybody. We do believe that in Acts 2, 38 to 41, after Peter preached this incredible message and people were cut to the heart, what do? Repent and be baptized, and this promise is for you and for your children. We do see in the book of Acts whole households being baptized. And whole households then is different than now. It's not mom and dad or a couple people under one roof. It's 30, 40, 50 people. We also know it was the common practice in early church. And the reason we know that is actually one of the only, at least that I've met, maybe or read or heard, one of the only detractors from this was Tertullian, who actually in his writing kind of justified the fact that infant baptism is going on everywhere. The Enlightenment age is when everything changed, and this thing that was the norm all of a sudden became not the norm. And I really believe it's because in the Enlightenment period, people want crystal clear black and white answers. And what I love about the Lutheran faith is we actually don't mind living in the gray and actually believe that's where our faith gets strengthened. So we do believe that when someone is baptized and it's connected to the water, that God's promise of the forgiveness of sins is real at that font for someone who's 2 weeks old or 90 years old. Now, does that faith need to be nurtured? 100%. But we also know that Jesus loved the little children and welcomed them and said, you've got to have faith like a little child. The Greek is more like an infant. How is that possible? How do infants have? I don't know. And at some point, if someone asks me enough questions, I'm going to get to the place as a good Lutheran and say, I don't know. And I actually like that there's a few things that I don't know.
Yeah.
I like that in communion, it's similar that the bread and wine, the way we phrase it is in, with, and under, or the body and blood of Jesus, I should say, is in, with, and under the bread and wine. How? I don't know. But I love the fact that
not quite Roman Catholic transubstantiation, but
it's
kind
in
of
the
a
middle.
hybrid between Calvin and
it's not turning into it. And so if you drop it, it's like a big sin. I don't get it. But when Jesus said, this is my body, this is my blood, that wasn't also his body and blood. That was bread and wine. And so there's something real and tangible. And the main point about both of those that I like from the Lutheran perspective is these sacraments then become more about what God does and what God gives to us than what we do for God, if that makes sense. And so I think it's awesome to have a believer's baptism and to say, I believe in God, and go into the waters, and I'm celebrating this in front of my family, my friends, my church family. I love that moment. In the Lutheran church, I would say that's what our confirmation is, just without water. Because we don't need to be baptized again because
someone said that to me.
Right.
Confirmation and baptism is just all about where you put the water. And there's truth to that. Well, all I know is 400 years ago, you would have burned me at the stake, or I would have burned you at the stake. And now all we do, we're friends, and we probably started a war in the comments. That's all I know. No, that's fascinating. Thank you. No, I appreciate that, because I think often if you're on one side of an issue or another, you can end up thinking, well, the other side is brainless. And the reality is they're not, for the most part.
And the last thing I tell people to remind them to kind of hopefully cool the temperature a little bit is there have literally been billions with a B, billions of people that have believed either one of these. So nobody's foolish, nobody's dumb. It's just a different matter of interpretation of Scripture. And at the end of it, I do think it's important, but at the end of it, we're good. God's going to take care of this, and we're all going to get up to heaven and realize we had some answers that we probably didn't know a lot more than what we said we knew.
So for the church planters listening, or those who are thinking of planting a church, what were some keys to early momentum when you planted your church?
Yeah, I think for us, I got to be a part of a network, and so our network. We had a vision to plant 7 churches. We moved there in 2010, so we had a vision 7 by 2020, and I was number 2 out of that. And so,
was this denominational network or not?
It was in our denomination. It was just a church in Lake Marion, Florida, that said we're gonna expand the gospel by planting churches. And so that was a network we created. So I loved being part of that network, and I think there's beauty just in, and probably hits a little more of the denomination stuff too. I think there's just beauty in working together and not being alone, and to know that you don't have to be alone. And so I would say get into a network. There's some really great ones. ARC's a really great community, Acts 29, but there's also a lot of smaller ones too. And so being a part of a network was really great to be able to bounce ideas off. We had, the leader of it had quite a bit of decades in ministry. And so he was just so wise and had so much experience that as a young church planter, I needed that. experience and that wisdom. And so I loved learning from him. The other thing that just specifically we did at our church, and obviously you can hear my heart and stuff that kind of came out of it, is like we were just really intentional from the beginning. Like, we're going to do what Jesus said. We're not going to settle. We're going to do things different. And if we err on anything, like, we're going to do what Jesus said. What I found when you take that approach with discipleship, with church, is it's really hard to argue with the premise of we're going to put the words of Jesus into practice. Like, if you're a Christian, it's hard to argue that. Even non-Christians don't mind if you do that, because guess what? Usually their world's better when you put the words of Jesus into practice too. And so we were just really diligent. Those are a couple of things that I think early on were key growth for us, is like working with others, and then just doubling down on our church is meant to produce disciples. And so, like, let's get back and let's do what Jesus called us to do.
What were some setbacks, challenges you faced along the way as a church planter?
Yeah, I think if anything, I mentioned earlier, like, it was really exciting because I was able to feel like I was able to put my faith on the line, every day. But even still, that struggle of like the being side of it, and church planters are such doers. And so I think for me, one of the struggles I had was to just do so much that I wasn't spending that time with God. And I think where it played out is, I think I just, rather than dependent on God, I think I was desperate and probably made some like hiring decisions early on, if you will, that like, if I'd have prayed about that and spent some time with the Lord, there was, but I have nobody, and this guy can, like, he knows how to play guitar, and so worth it. Let's go. So just probably more, I would have challenged myself to be more dependent on God and less desperate. And then I would say, like, there's such an advantage of working with a network, but I also think, like, one of the things we didn't do well that I have coached and that I continue to coach church planters on is really understanding, if you're a part of a network, like thinking through, like, what are the outcomes, so what in the end this is going to work, how it's going to work. Because if you don't have clarity up front, it's going to create a lot of friction on the back end, and it did for us. Like, we actually outgrew the main campus 3-4 years in, and that nobody had ever thought of that. That wasn't a concept. And it was always, we're going to be,
I'm familiar with that.
Yeah, we're going to be one
This is
vision, one
working.
mission, one budget, one board. And like, that sounds really good. And it is really good. And it is a call for some. But we also hired like type A personalities and told them, lead your churches in underneath this really broad mission. Lead your churches this way and match the needs of your community. And when you do that and you issue that challenge to them, you end up creating churches that are quite different from one another. And so you're not comparing apples and oranges all the time when you're talking about things as a network. And it just created a lot of friction for us. We ended up moving out of that network 6 years in and chartering on our own. And to me, it's like, that's what a good network always ought to do, is like, you get a church that can be self-sustaining and now can actually plant their own church. Like, that ought to be the win. But that wasn't stated up front, and it left a lot of friction. And so to me, if you're a part of a network, like in church planting especially, I mentioned it earlier, church planting it always has been the number one way for churches to reach new people. And so, but there's different ways to do it. And so, clarity on the way you want to do it. Do you want to be a part of this network, and we'll plant a church with you, which means, like, we're gonna pray for you. We're gonna support you depending on where your location is. We may even send people your way. But in the end, like, you're gonna be in charge of your own constitution, your articles of incorporation, crafting a budget, and it's your church. Like, you won't always have the financial support from us. Or do you want to be a campus of our church that you get to share one vision, one mission, one budget, one board, and that'll be the way it always is. And so if 2-3 years from now you're like, I really want to have a church on my own, that's good for you. Like, but that's our church, because that's the clarity we had. Like, I think getting that crystal clear is really important up front, and to recognize that both are methods of church planting and extremely effective. It's just more what matches your style, your DNA, your leadership, your gifts, and that clarity is really important.
It's sort of counterintuitive, but I learned that in my time in law. You have to think about how it ends before you begin it, right? Like, is this all independent churches down the road? But we get so caught up in beginning, it gets difficult. So walk us through, when you started, obviously, it's you and your wife and your kids, but you were there for how long, Zach?
Yeah, we were there 11 years. And so
11
we started as
years.
a church planter, and then 10 years in, we shifted from lead pastor to more of a supportive role. But 11 years we were there, yeah.
11 years. And then by the time you had transitioned out of that church, what size was it?
Yeah, we grew it up to about 900 on a weekend, about 7
Yeah.
years in. And then we had, that was 2018, early part of
Mhm.
2019. And then we had like two really good pruning seasons. First one for us
Mm.
was, this was a year before COVID. In 2019, for us, we actually lost the lease on our space. And so we had to move about 800 people in a city that's pretty small, to a high school. And so we had to
Mm.
do portable church. It was the only option left for us. And it was really hard to take that year. I've had a lot of conversation with God, and I feel okay about how things are now. But um, so we lost about 25%. They never even made the move over to a mile and
Wow.
a half.
Just left.
Just left. And so that was brutal. And then we had COVID. So a few months after that. And so that was some serious pruning as well. I will say what I'm really proud of the leaders there, like they've grown it back since I left there, even 3 years ago. They're back at those heightened numbers of 800, 900 on a weekend,
That's
and
awesome.
going to see God do even more things. So.
What happened to your time management as the church grew, relatively rapidly over a decade?
Yeah, that is hard. It's hard. That's why. So being a church planter and then kind of going through those modes early on in my career of now I've got a church plant to a small church to a medium church to a large church to a church in two locations.
Mhm.
Like each one of those, like you have to wear a different hat as a leader and as a pastor. And I did not always do that well. On the side of it as well, Carey, I mentioned that golf head cover business. I had that going till 2017. And then about a year later is when Red Letter Living started. And so I've kind of always been in doing a lot of those things. And so for us, it's not always been easy. I would say that's been one of the challenges of my life
Mm.
is balancing that with a wife of now 20 years. And we've got two boys that are 17 and 13 right now. And so for us, it's taken some counseling. I remember in 2017, by the way, I ran into your stuff 2015, 2016, 2017, and it was right around the time of counseling that I was also going through. At that time, it was called the High Impact Leader course. I think you call it your
Mhm.
At Your Best
It was.
course
That was
now.
the original
Yeah,
iteration of At Your Best, was a high impact leader.
for sure. And so, like, legitimately, that was some of the first time I'd learned those things. And I want you to
Mm.
hear from my heart, like, that changed me in a really positive way. And so I had that going
Thank you.
kind of in the background. And at the same time, like, we finally decided for the first time in our life, Alice and I, we need to see a counselor. And
Mm.
Carey, we knew what he was going to say, but we just
Yeah.
needed him to say it. And this is what he said. He said, each of you are doing too much. You each need to come back and tell me 3 things that you're going to say no to. And I said, if I say no to you right now, does that count as one of my 3? And he said, no, that doesn't. so, so for me, what it meant in 2017 is it meant for me saying no to my head cover business and letting that go. For
Wow.
Allison, it meant her saying no to being the kids minister at the Cross. And that was really hard because she was super good at it. And it took us a long time to figure out what that's going to look like. And so those were a couple of the things. And at the same time, going through your course, and I started learning how to calendar, blocking my calendar. I started reorganizing the org chart. I had everybody with 15 staff, and I had everybody reporting to me.
Mm.
Those things changed in that year. It may have been through your course, but it also may have been through your podcast and listening to Andy Stanley. He taught a 3-word question that I've found to be super helpful when I'm trying to manage my time. And it's the question, is it wise? And
Mhm.
I think
Mhm.
nobody's going to eliminate all stress. I don't even think that's a biblical pursuit that God offers to us. We're going to have trouble. We're going to have stress in this world. But I think it can cut half of your unnecessary stress is just that filter of, is it wise? And so those were all things that like I was kind of learning at the same time. And I would say 2017, I did a 3-month sabbatical. My church gave me a 3-month sabbatical in 2018. And so I started putting a lot more of those into practice. But other than that, yeah, it was. I'm telling you, it was a challenge, and I didn't. The people that ended up paying for it are the ones that I loved the most, which was my wife and my kids. or it was God who should be first in all of it. And so my relationship with God was struggling when I'm doing all these things. And then the ones that I love the most are sort of getting my leftovers. And that's when, for me, I recognize, like, I really need to redo this, or this ain't going to end well for me. And so, again, part of what I say to you, and I know I've said this before to you, I really think, like, you do a lot of this, what you do, to help people prevent burnout. And I want to tell you, like, I've never burnt out. And I think, like, you could be a reason proactively why I never did, because I learned your stuff. And that's what I want to challenge young leaders right now is, like, you don't have to burn out. You can already be putting things into place right now before you get there. You can listen to the wisdom and experience from people that have gone before you and done good or bad things, and hear from them and actually change what you do so that you're not another number. And so for me, Carey, this meant going through all of this journey, and then all this red letter living stuff starts in 2018, kind of like, I shouldn't say totally unexpectedly, but like where God took it was like ridiculous. Like, and now I'm stuck again in 2019 with, like, I'm running a church and now I'm running a business. And I tried to say no to these things, and yet it keeps finding me. And we had a breakfast in Orlando, you, me, and my wife. And I said, Carey, when did you know that it was right for you to leave your church, and more, not like leave it, but to leave the lead pastor role?
Yeah, to get out of the top leadership seat.
Yeah. Yep. Do you remember what you said to me?
I don't, so you're going to have to remind me. I imagine I know. There were like 5 reasons, but...
Yeah, it's probably one of your big lines, but you said it to me personally. I need to hear it. It says, you said to me that, Zach, when I felt like I was putting 10 times the energy at church and getting 1x out of it, and then on my podcast and my blog, when I was putting 1 time the energy there and getting 10x out of it, I had to really look at things. And for me, that was like, I needed to hear that, because that's exactly how I felt. It wasn't like I didn't like putting the 10x in at the church. I love the church. But it was like I'm putting 1x in over here on the red letter side of things, and it just feels like, God, you're there. And so we were left at the end of 19, and we had that breakfast. And it wasn't long after that at the age of, 36? And again, this is where I say I probably prevented from burnout. I made the choice at the age of 36 to stop being a lead pastor and to be I still wanted to be a pastor though, but to be a supportive pastor in a teaching pastor role where I don't lead. And, like, that's just not what most people do. But it felt like, God, that's what you want for me. And at the end of the day, like, I want to steward what you've given to me, and I want to spend these years loving my wife and my kids super well. And so that was a huge decision for me that could be a great decision that has prevented me from maybe falling into things that otherwise I could have fallen into. We'll never know.
Well, there's a lot there. If it's true that, my little contribution really helped you stay out of burnout, I'm so grateful for that. That's really my heart behind it. It's like, you don't have to make the same mistake. And just to clarify the principle, no, you're absolutely right. That it was a main factor. There were a few others, but I felt like, in the early days of church leadership, it was a little bit of effort, a lot of results. And it eventually, after 2 decades, felt like a lot of effort and good results. We were still growing 10% or whatever. But I would work on this leadership content, whether it was writing or the podcast or a book or speaking, and it was 1x effort, 10x results. And I'm like, God, are you trying to get my attention here? I mean, I don't want to be totally results driven, but there's a certain point at which you're kind of like, I got to pay attention to this. And you found the same thing. Now, you found yourself, when did you join King of Kings as their teaching pastor?
Yeah, so we joined here in summer of 2021. So I stayed on at my church I planted in Florida for almost a year in a supportive role. And I had a good time. I'm not saying it wasn't without challenges. There were decisions that the leadership made there that I'm like, I wouldn't have made that decision. So that was hard to sit in that secondary seat and to bite my tongue. But I could also tell, like, the leaders that we'd built up and the pastors that are there now, like, they're ready. They kind of want to take the ball and run with it. And I actually think they're going to do better without me. And so that took about 6 months to kind of mourn and grieve, because I loved that church. That was my baby. I look back at those 11 years. I was like, oh man, that was so fun. And we did so many fun and crazy things.
It's hard to not be the leader, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is.
When you've been the leader?
Yeah. So that's when, like, God, what are you doing? And a situation, opened up for us to be here at King of Kings in Omaha, Nebraska. This is where I grew up, Carey. So we moved here when I was 10, and my dad was the lead pastor here for 28, 29 years. He just retired a couple of years ago. But it's kind of neat, like looking back, that I get to come back to a place that was so formational in my faith that now I can hopefully, in a good way, pour my gifts and talents into the church here. So it's a niche role. It's a teaching pastor role here, which is what we wanted. And so it's kind of like I get to be a part of the teaching team and get to be in ministry here at the church because I love being a part of the local church and do feel called to that. But at the same time, they've given me enough space in my weekly, but also in my annual quarterly calendars to continue to on the Red Letter Living mission. And so it's been a really sweet spot for us to hopefully maximize our role at a local church, but still be a blessing to the capital C church.
And to clarify, Red Letter Living is your writing and teaching ministry that you've been doing. How many books have you written now?
Yeah, Red Letter Living's our mission. Our company is to challenge all people to be greater disciples of Jesus. So we produce resources. I'd say our niche is 40-day challenges, and so we have 4 40-day challenges that we've written that are all discipleship based. I write the adult one, or the older student one, and my wife Allison writes the kids one, and she's actually a supernatural writer. And that made that decision of jumping into Red Letter Living a little more fully. Even more is like I can do this with my wife. So she writes the kids' books. And then we actually co-wrote one this year that just came out called Red Letter Advent. It's helping churches celebrate this season of Advent. But they're all discipleship focused. And that's definitely our niche. We have a podcast, and our stuff's on Right Now Media, and we do webinars and all things like that in addition. But yeah.
What are some tips on working with your spouse, with your wife?
Oh man, yeah, that's a good one. I love working with Allison. We've worked together honestly our entire marriage. She started helping me with the head covers early on in the seminary years, and it provided a chance for her to work a little bit when we had young kids. And then she was the kids minister at the church I was at, and now, of course, we do Red Letter Living together. I would say a couple things that are important for me is through it all, she's by my side. And so if she has opinions or strong urges, I need to carry the weight of what she says 10x of what anyone else says. Because I know in the end, I'm with her and she's with me, and she's been loyal and committed. And so I think that's super important. I wish that we had and knew the working genius stuff 20 years ago when we started.
All right. Pat's been on here talking about that a little bit.
That is a game changer.
There's 6 categories. What are you and what is she? Do you know that off the top of your head?
Absolutely. That's a game changer. So I'm a galvanizer inventor, and she's a discerner enablement. And so what this means is I come up with ideas and they're all great and let's go. That's what a galvanizer inventor does.
She's a discerner going, hang on a second.
And she's a discerner. And so when I didn't have those concepts or that language, it got to be really frustrating because, Carey, I'm cooking great ideas all day long.
Oh, yeah.
And I share
never had a bad idea.
Yeah.
Right?
And I share it with her and she's like, nope, that won't work for this and this and this. And I'm like, oh.
I have to be so careful. I'm the worst in brainstorming sessions because I'm a discerner too. I can see the problems the moment before you finish the sentence. I'm like, well, here are 5 challenges you're going to face, which ironically is what I do for a living. But, with a little bit of discretion, you can frame that positively in a way that's helpful rather than the killjoy in every meeting.
Yeah. 100%. And so I'm not in the working genius, you have 2 that you're really good at, 2 that are frustrations that you're not good at, or that you don't find joy in, I should say, is more accurate. And then there's 2 that you are capable in. So actually discernment's a capability for me. And I think that's even worse because it's no, I actually have discerned this a little bit. And then when she's telling me no. And so I think understanding that, that's her way to kind of process things. And she's actually not saying no to everything. But it's also important for me that, I don't need to share every idea I get right away. I can probably sit on it for 24 hours. I think that was a Seinfeld thing as a comedian. It's he never shares what he writes in the first 24 hours. Because it's
you're right. He said that. Yeah.
And so I think there's wisdom in that. It's let it bake, especially for us who are galvanizers, inventors that maybe that discernment's not a competency or a genius for us. Is let it sit for a while and before you share it. And so anyway, those are some things like I wish I'd have known that. I think now that we know that, we work together a lot better. And we complement each other well.
Two final questions for you, Zach. Now that you are not the lead pastor at King of Kings, hard to sit on your hands or a role you adjusted to pretty quickly?
I think if I didn't have Red Letter Living that allows me a space to galvanize, to lead, to rally, it'd be a lot more challenging for me. I will say, Carey, that I don't sit in a number one seat. I'm in a secondary or whatever, tertiary, whatever seat it is. I don't know what it is. I'm not in that lead seat, but I cannot not think like a lead pastor. And so it's just ingrained in me. I think about 95 days out of 100, I'm really content in the seat that I sit in. And about 5 days out of 100, I struggle. And I'm like, man, I really wish I was the lead pastor today because I would have said, I would have done X, Y, Z. And what's been helpful for me is our lead pastor, Greg Griffith, who's a great friend. He's in your Art of Leadership Academy. You know him. Is he allows me the space and the time to come and share with him on those 5 out of 100 days why I would have said something, why I would have done something. Every now and then, it actually might change his mind because if I'm that passionate about it, he probably should listen. But there's also like he hears me and he's like, "Yeah, we're still not doing what you think," and at the end of it, like I actually feel okay. I got to vent, I got to share it, and he's the lead pastor and has to deal with so many different things. I think what's hard for people that have never sat in a lead pastor position is you just don't know what a lead pastor experiences or goes through. And to think that you do is foolish. And so I know what that's like and who he's got to answer to and how he's got to drip that vision down and execute that, or at least somewhat of what that's like. I don't know exactly because I've not been the lead pastor in this church in that seat, but I understand it enough.
But you get the
know.
dynamic.
Yeah, and I understand it enough to know I can share my opinion and go home at night and not have to be the guy that implements it. And so from that perspective, it's been really good. I would say, if I could real quick on that what I have noticed, though, is that if you are a number one, if you're a lead pastor and you've got, guys like me that are driven, that are motivated, that are doers, are self-starters, are galvanizers, inventors, like you may be leaving more on the table with those people if you don't invite them in and actually allow them places. Because I still have that. And I get it with Red Letter, but there's also times at church here at King of Kings where I'm like, I want to do X, Y, or Z. And actually, I had this conversation with Pastor Greg about 12 months ago. I was like, hey, man, I don't know what it is, but the last 6 months, I know I'm not the leader, but it does feel like my leadership muscles here in the local church are kind of grown atrophy. And like, I don't like that. I feel like for me to be a better leader on the Red Letter side, I got to lead something here at King of Kings. And so like, think about it. And for me, this was me saying like, I want to do more. I can do more. I'm ready to do more. And he did listen and he did give me more. And you got to be careful because he threw everything at me the very next day. But I think like there are those people that sit in those number 2 or number 3 or whatever seats they are, that there could be like, if you'd listen to their ideas, like they might want to run with these things and allow them, because that can be frustrating when they're in those seats and they want to do things and want to lead things and they don't get those outlets. There could be people on your staffs right now that like, they're ready to go and like, let's see what they can do.
No, and that's a testimony to Greg too. It takes a very secure leader to have strong people in secondary or tertiary roles. Okay, final question. I would love to get your best advice for those who are entrepreneurial, who are listening, who have a day job, whether that's a lead pastor in business or staff role at a church, who have a side hustle or want to start one. What are some do's and don'ts for leaders? Because, I mean, you and I are cut from a similar cloth, I think. And one of the reasons I don't really have a side hustle is what I do right now is so one day it's a podcast and every interview is a new interview. And then I'm writing something and then I'm working on a book and then I'm speaking and flying into a new city. So it feels like a constant stream of steady distractions and interesting things to me, which is great. It's a dream job. I'm very blessed to be able to do what I do. But, when I was in that one role, I really found that I was always gravitating toward a side hustle, very similar to you. So what advice do you have for leaders who are drawn to the same?
Yeah, obviously, let's start with like what should be obvious, that if we're believers and Christians and pastors and leaders, let's start by spending time in prayer with the Lord and really discerning
Mm.
His voice in it. And I think obviously talking with people who've gone through it is really great counsel and advice to have somebody who's done something like this. And so yeah, what I would say is if it's just a side thing, like let's shoot bullet, like just Jim Collins, right? Shoot bullets,
Mhm.
then cannons. Like, cool, go with it, see what happens. And maybe a couple of years later, you're left with a bigger decision, which you were left with, Carey, which I was left with. And then I needed to make a whole new decision of, God, are you calling me into this?
Yeah.
So I think sometimes people like it is a side thing. And so you don't need to uproot anything and everything. But if you feel like God is putting something in your heart, and that's what Red Letter Challenge was for me, our first book was like, I just feel like for whatever reason, I'm not a writer. Nobody's ever told me, or a professor or a teacher never said like, one day you're going to be a writer and people are going to read your stuff and it's going to be make an impact in the world. Like that's crazy. That's foolish. But for whatever reason, this new concept we had with our church plan of doing what Jesus calls us to do, putting his words into practice, was a 7-year idea that I could not get out of my brain, that I felt like God put in my lap to steward for this generation and beyond. And so, okay, I will do what I need to do. I don't know what I'm doing, but I will take steps. And it took me 7 years, Carey, to write the first book because I never planned on it. I never knew how. I was leading a church full time. So like, but it was a bullet. And like at the end of it, I was like, cool, God, I was faithful with what you told me to do. Now I'm going to get back to my day job, lead pastor. And it didn't happen that way. That was a bullet that I felt like I was faithful with. And then if it goes, if in a spiritual world, it's anointed, like awesome. Then start asking the next questions of, is this a side thing? Or God, are you calling me more into this? And those are a whole new set of conversations. Yeah.
Well, Zach, it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. If people want to know about Red Letter Living, where can they go and where can they find you online?
Yeah, absolutely. I would encourage, especially pastors and church leaders, check out redletterchallenge.com/join, redletterchallenge.com/join. There you can see what we do with Red Letter, especially our 40-day challenges. We actually have a link on there to grab a free 40-day challenge for the USA pastors. If you're international, we'll send you digital samples, but you can get a free pastor there. Our free book there. And then email me, Zach, Z-A-C-H, at redletterchallenge.com if you want to talk discipleship or press in a little more. I'd love to do that. It's what God's put me in a place to do. And if I can help your church and have a conversation with you about it, I would love to. So thanks, Carey. And you said earlier, if what you said is true about me helping prevent burnout, it is true. You're a blessing to so many. And I truly hope that God just continues to anoint and bless what you're doing. And happy to call you friend and thankful for you having me on today.
Well, I'm really grateful we met and really excited for the journey ahead too. Thank you so much, Zach.
Absolutely.